Yeah, okay. Well, we can start in a minute or so formally, but just to remind everyone coming in that this is being recorded. So if you want to pop your camera off or whatever, that's absolutely fine. It's very early in the morning here, so I completely would understand that. But we'll wait another moment or so because I can see people are joining. Um, but yeah. Uh, and then, Leslie, are you able to pop? Oh, I see you were doing it. Some of the links in the chat. And please do remember, if you can access the session notes from the chat, please do sign in. It'd be very useful for us to know who's been here. Um, so yeah, thank you very much. All right. Well, people are filtering in, so I will make a start because we got quite a lot to get through. Um, Thank you so much for joining us. Um, I'm going to start sharing my screen. So we've got some slides to go through. Okay, everyone can see that okay? Brilliant. Okay, so thank you so much for joining us. This is the first progress report of the Repo to Pub working group. So that's the Coordinating Earth, Space and Environmental Science Data Preservation and Scholarly Publication Process working group, Repo to Pub because it's a little more manageable. So the chairs of the group are Danny Kincaid, Natalie Rea, myself, Matt Wark, and Leslie Wyborn. It's been me and Leslie who are here today because the timing of this doesn't really work for Danny and Natalie in the US. So I'll be chairing the session today, and Leslie will be monitoring the chat. And just a reminder for those who've come in, the session is being recorded as part of the RDA conference format. We have links to collaborative notes and our group webpage there. Okay, so just a quick slide that they've asked us to include about welcoming new members to the RDA this year, just guiding you through the 6 principles that are at the heart: openness, consensus, harmonization, the work that we do is community-driven, nonprofit and technology neutral and inclusive, and a link to join. Okay, so this is our agenda for today. So the first part, we'll just go through some housekeeping, welcomes, introductions. Then we'll start to get into just a quick background for those of you who may not have had interaction with the group before, what it's about, what the statement of work is. And then we'll have a report on the first 6 months of progress against the work plan of the group. And then the main bulk of the session will be two kind of interactive sessions. So we'll have a speaker, Chris Burbage from ICRAG in Ireland, will give us a little bit of his viewpoint from the point of view of a repository. We've had some slides contributed by other repositories, so Morphobank and BecoDemo, which I'll sort of run through as well. But unfortunately, those speakers are not able to make this time slot, again, being in the US. But we can see similar themes and what they're identifying. And then one of the main things that we'd like to do is to discuss our planned interview framework for discussing workflow issues with publishers and journal editors. So this is linked within the session notes. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that as we go along, take a look at the questions that we're proposing, and we very much welcome any feedback that you have for us on the best kind of questions that we can be putting to publishers. And then the final 10 minutes, we'll just pull the key strands together, recap, and identify what our takeaways are. So yeah, just a reminder, the working group co-chairs, we have Danny Kincaid at Woods Hole, Natalie Rea at the University of Arizona, myself, Matt Wark, I'm the geoscience manager at Taylor and Francis, and Leslie Wyborn at ANU. Okay, so what is the Repo2Pub working group been about? So the problem that we've been addressing or working to address is related to the fact that, increasingly as we go forward, funders are requiring more data to be archived in appropriate repositories. On the counter side, publishers are increasingly requiring that the data that's being cited within a publication is stored in a recognized repository and that links into the published version of record via a DOI. Okay, but as we can kind of see from this graphic here, there's a little bit of an issue when it comes to the syncing of this between the timescale of publishers and the timescale of domain repositories, the time, not just the time scale and the time needed, but time at which this deposition is done. So there's a kind and the groups of stakeholders involved, particularly between the domain repositories and the publishers, there's little awareness and communication needs, at least in the Earth and Space Sciences, that I know we've got some people here from other communities, and we very much welcome hearing what's happening in those communities about this. But there's little awareness and communication about the needs and the timelines from different stakeholder perspectives. So publishers, repositories, researchers who are caught in the middle of all of this, and funders as well, as often the playing a key component in shaping the mandates that everybody is trying to follow. So the problem really starts at the problem specifically that this working group is trying to address is what happens when researchers try to begin the data publication process at the time of manuscript submission. So in an ideal world, the data deposition and curation would all have happened long before the manuscript journey begins, or just before the manuscript journey begins, but that's often not what we find. And so researchers come up against this issue where disciplinary curation obviously takes time and it involves involvement from the researcher. But as the paper is also linked paper is moving through the publication process, there is pressure at that point of manuscript submission to generate a DOI. And so what often happens is that authors understandably turn to generalist repositories for data publication. And so this has the effect that the opportunity to make the data more fair through that curation process is lost. And just a reminder, so domain repositories, they're providing that curation to make sure that the data is truly fair. It does require time, it requires author awareness. Publishers have to work across a range of portfolios within existing workflows, existing technological platforms that they use with limited flexibility often, and to develop and enforce data publication guidance. And that can be challenging for all concerned. So we have this kind of antagonistic relationship, which you can see in the cogs. So what do we need? We need consensus. We need a common frame of reference to improve the efficiency of that data flow from researcher to repository to publisher. So the way that Natalie has nicely shown this in this graphic is we need another cog. We need a cog that adds shared understanding, sustainable partnerships, and new guidance directly between domain repositories and publishers. And then the theory is the system should work a little bit smoother for everyone involved. And we are moving to a place where more of the data in the Earth, environmental and space sciences is being deposited in a fair, compliant way. So that's really where the group draws its inspiration. That's the original problem it's set out to solve. So let's have a look at the statement of work. So our objectives are to establish a shared understanding of Earth, environmental and space science repository requirements, specifically with regards to that timeline, best practices for appraisal and deposition, and to make the case more clearly to different communities within this area, the value that discipline-specific curation represents. To establish a shared understanding of journal needs concerning data availability, citation, and preferred timing. And So there's kind of two stakeholder groups that are being referred to in there. That journal needs refers not just to publishers and how publishers can actually do this and operationalize this, but also journal editors who are often, along with publishing staff, tasked with checking a lot of this. Educate and inform data publication stakeholders on the workflow of journals and touch points with the author. So again, this is something that through all of the discussions we've had in the working group, and this is what we'd like to get into with the questions we're asking for your feedback today, is trying to demystify from the point of view of particularly repositories, how publishers are actually doing this under the hood, and trying to make it clearer what their workflow is. And then we want to document a set of use cases from different stakeholder viewpoints. So from repositories, from publishers at a publisher level, but also journal editors at an individual journal level to kind of understand the different levels at which this is not that we don't necessarily have the best integration between journals and domain specific repositories. And ideally to create models of idealized workflows and a set of recommendations that contain the actions to support and facilitate data and scholarly publication workflows in the earth space and environmental sciences. So that's what we're about here, and that's what the group is trying to do. And I've got a link there in the slides to the full statement of work, which you can read. Okay, so how are we doing? What's our 6-month report? So in the first 6 months, what we set out to do was document a set of repository use cases that demonstrate from the repository standpoint what the bottlenecks are in the publication process. Now, over the course of the last number of months in our meetings at the monthly meetings of the working group and also meetings of the Coalition for the Open Publication of Data in the Earth and Space Sciences, COPDES, we took the decision to change from our initial approach, which was to use a use case template that we would send to repositories. Instead, we've made the decision to use semi-structured interviews. The decision to do that was taken because in discussion with publishers and editors, we felt like the complexity that we were asking for wouldn't be able to be well captured by the template that we have. And it also wasn't well suited to organizations which had a multiplicity of workflows. So in a repository, there's maybe 1 or 2 workflows. I don't want to oversimplify, but as opposed to in a publisher that could have hundreds or thousands of journals, all of which operate under a slightly different editorial policy and not even under the same technological platforms. So that's very complex to capture with a single use case template. So an interview would be a better way to kind of get and tease out that information. So that was the decision that we took. We've also socialized the project and made a lot of groups across the sector aware of it. And we're also aware and have had great discussions and presentation in the last couple of months within the working group from the EU-funded Tier 2 project, which has been doing an awful lot of work across academia and publishing space, working on identifying those common strands and what publishers' workflows are for checking data availability and also checking data deposition. And they're also working towards a set of guidelines, a handbook of recommendations. So we're also aware of the work that they're doing and trying to add to it, not duplicate what they're doing. We have prepared interview questions for those semi-structured interviews for repositories, and we have a provisional set of questions for publishers and journal editors, and that's what we'd like to get into in this session to get some feedback on. And the progress of that right now is obviously having changed to a semi-structured interview approach. We need to go through the full IRB review That's being conducted at the University of Arizona and Woods Hole. The co-chairs that will be involved have undertaken relevant training necessary for that now, and so that is working its way through, I believe, the final stages of IRB approval, and then we will be good to begin the repository interviews in earnest. So that's a little bit behind, but I think we've also been able to make headway with what our goals for months 6 to 12 are, by our work with our discussions with tier 2 and trying to understand what we do and don't have to do to replicate things. So we have, I think generally we're in a very strong place. We also are at this point looking for a list of potential repositories and publishers to interview. So we're making a list of those. There's a link here in the slides. There's a link in the collaborative notes for the session as well. If you're from a repository, if you'd like to be involved, if you'd like to be interviewed, if you know people who you think would be interested in this, that you don't think would mind being approached by us, please do add their information into that spreadsheet, because we'd like to build a wide network of people that we can reach out to once we have that IRB approval. But as part of the IRB process, please don't add any email addresses at this point, just general contact information. That would be very, very useful. Okay. Are there any questions on that at this stage? Want to ask anything about that? Okay, silence is good. All right. So with that, we will obviously the agenda says update on repository interviews, and the update is that we can't conduct those yet until we've had the IRB signed off. But we're almost there. So with that, we have now a few different viewpoints from repositories. So I'm going to pass over to our speaker, and then we have a couple of slides that have been contributed, which I will go through. But yeah, Chris is going to give us some viewpoints on from the perspective of his repository at iCrag. So Chris, I will stop sharing and pass the floor over to you.
Hi. Okay. You can see the slides okay?
Yeah, we can see them.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
So thanks, Matt. Chris Burbage will talk you through some publication workflows and a lot of the infrastructure initiatives that I've been working on around Irish geoscience. This between my affiliation in the iCrag Research Ireland Centre for Applied Geosciences and my current role in UCD IT Services. So to introduce iCrag, it's a leading research centre with members around the country, links to industry and government, and essentially it's a very big project that's running, current phase is running to the end of 2026. So it's a big project linking up a lot of legal entities, a lot of institutions and agencies, etc. iCrag Geodata platform that I was mostly involved with, or sort of principally involved with in iCrag, is a kind of infrastructure focused platform that underpins activities around the center. And this was set up initially with an analytics kind of ticket, really looking at moving from conceptual geological model driven approaches to numerical model driven approaches. But as work went on, and as we were looking at center needs and building up momentum around the area, data infrastructure and data management actually was then put in as a reporting theme for the center, with the main basic aims and objectives of making the data sets visible and citable. Now, I was saying about infrastructure build is really about building linkages and networks, putting policies in place, but then looking at setting up the infrastructure to enable those policies for data management, and hence the funding that I was working on to enable this at both. So this is looking at both a sort of strategic and a technical level for the center. Strategic stakeholders. Well, when I first arrived, I interviewed a number of students and staff, actually worked with a number of them on case studies on sort of more analytics side. This led into project development around at national level, and particularly with HEANet that you can see there, our National Education and Research Network. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about has kind of grown from this work with HEANet, which was really positive. Now, HEANet, of course, are part of the GÉANT Association of Education and Research Networks around Europe, and connect in with initiatives like EUDAT, Collaborative Data Infrastructure, and the European Open Science Cloud. And then on the other side of the ICRAG logo there, the key thing, the Geological Survey of Ireland. So we're then looking at working with our Geological Survey government department, resourced and mandated for archiving data that can feed data up into Europe and internationally via different pathways, let's say. So we're looking at sort of setting up connections of those kinds and working on those areas, but in order to actually implement infrastructure, we connect within the university and deal with the different areas of administration within the uni. And then ultimately, as you see in the bottom right-hand corner of both sort of sections, you got legal. The section at the top leading into legal, but then as I've laid out a few sort of interactive ideas and sort of themes, but ultimately we end up at the bottom right-hand corner in confidentiality, intellectual property. And so when you're setting up data infrastructures, a lot of it does come down to putting the other things in place, but then sorting it out with the legal. Right at the bottom, who wishes to take responsibility, who can take it, and how to drive the process. Now, this is very much an active discussion in Ireland. And so we're sort of working on that, and it brings us right down to that top bubble with the National Open Research Forum, which I briefly managed, the department that we're associated with, our research funders, and our high-end compute nationally as well. And all of this is in the mix at the moment still. Okay, so for ICRAG itself, though, I looked at sort of laying out a business architecture. We're not going to go around the diagram. I just want to point out you kind of got the white core bit, that's ICRAG ideas, then looking at institutional, and then beyond that, actually, center and national, because the center is multi-institutional, and then out to Europe. Three main infrastructure focus on accessible compute and GPU usage, data warehousing, then object storage and file sharing, which kind of have different thrusts, but the storage stuff does get a bit mixed up together. Again, with the impacts around visibility and citability, I'll shortcut to the end and say for visibility, we really focus on GSI, on the Geological Survey partnering and setting up metadata with them, and an in-house build in ICRAG, which then needs to be linked for citability to what's available through the university, which has its limitations for DOI generation, Zenodo, or looking out to a EUDAT B2 share. So on the accessible compute and GPU, a lot of work around machine learning using general sort of high power, but general compute and GPU. But for us, a lot of data sets are so big that we're not going to be able to, say, associate them, put them up, publish them with papers. We need to look at 3-4D deep time visualization. This uses specialized kit. It's got to be linked to big fast storage. And that infrastructure needs to be established, but also the community that's using it, they're familiar with Windows, not HPC, and they're using licensed software. So there are a lot of issues around the workflows and around what you can and can't do in there, trying to set up an appropriate, secure, and yet accessible means of examining the data. So this is looking at fair, open, yes, but really fair to enable it, because we're looking at management of property. Then metadata is key, and there'll be some more on that below. Within the ecosystem that we're working, there's a lot of factors, as I've been indicating, to take into account. I'm not going to run through all these, but I've just laid out a kind of matrix there, 5 different lines, each with their own sort of things, their own items to cross-relate. But a key thing for us is that we can get working on active data infrastructure. It's time limited, it's funded by projects. And so there's a reasonable amount of activity around this. At the moment, our center, iCRAG, is running on Google. The UCD as an institute, though, is transitioning to Microsoft. And in Research IT, where I'm working now, we're running Dropbox as a pilot, but hopefully going production. Meanwhile, collaborating at European level on EUDAT, EarlDat initiatives. So Irish EUDAT, basically, and that is going to production, but it's not a fully commercial product. So we're looking, as an institution, we kind of need to stick with things that are a bit more steady, but keep our hand in and really try and promote the more developmental community things. But you'll notice this differential between the EU and essentially US-based companies there. However, the largest data quantities we're dealing with aren't really active data. It's what I've come to call metastable data. It's basically the stuff you need to retain for compliance or future use that would traditionally just sit on people's hard drives during their career. Now, around this, the IP on this is institutional. The projects are signed off by the schools, not by iCRAG, not by the center. And we need to be quite careful about, even though the center is very good, in a good position to aggregate, but it has to be quite careful about how it manages the different owners of the data. So I mentioned the metastable data. We have a kind of, in the short head and long tail, we have about a 300 terabyte metastable body of that. Then there's the long tail, all the sort of difficult small stuff that's spread around. But the short head is actually a small number of projects that take you up into multi-petabyte levels. So looking at trying to develop this, I've mentioned some plans, and we have, well, I want to give props to Abdul Ifal, the iCRAG data manager, Brendan Kennett, iCRAG IT manager, and Niall Reenan, the School of Earth Sciences IT manager, who are really sort of putting a lot of this stuff into action. And I'll in particular mention Caldera because Niall is actually building a private cloud for the school. So we can't kind of, at an institutional level, it's tricky for us to implement solutions like this. We need to go full enterprise level and get the resourcing for that. But the school is doing a lot of stuff there, and we're getting that around UCD, various sort of a network that hopefully can be federated in future. Meanwhile, Abduli with the DSpace repository, this is kind of going to be metadata focused though, rather than the data itself. The core of where you're storing all this data is still an issue, but that will help then with the PID minting. So GSI doesn't do it, but we have UCDs and Odo, but the space is limited. So again, you're looking metadata rather than data. But then we have some potential through EUDAT at EU level, working through this EarlDat production service, and it'll be a next stage. But there is potential within these EU level systems to get in there. Now, it's a general challenge. It's not just for us. The National Open Research Forum has just issued, or recently issued, PID recommendations, though those are more about what you need to be doing rather than how you're going to implement it in the nitty-gritty. So for metadata, based on the idea that FAIR is basically machine readable, and what's been achievable now for the center is to agree a limited number of fields with the Geological Survey to kickstart onboarding, but that still leaves a lot of work to be done. So my aim is really to get the GSI schema actioned for automated transfers. And this is based on the idea that the Geological Survey have already invested a lot of effort and have a lot of resources to actually establish their schema, their metadata schema, in a way that should facilitate not only our provision to them, but integration with other spaces and help develop the EU nodes and data spaces, which is sort of I'm kind of involved with in other areas. So for myself, doing this in iCRAG through a number of projects, but three key ones at the moment. which are around a geothermal database and geochronological database development, both of which are GSI projects. And then at the bottom of the list, a EuroCC digital flagship with iCheck, the Irish Centre for High-End Compute, called EarthCheck. And so now that project takes us more into kind of evaluation, looking at the landscape and communication area. EarthCheck, we're really bringing stuff together with staff from iCrag and iCheck and consultation with folks that can't be directly involved, and just trying to get the definitions down and publish these. And as I mentioned, support the national data space in EOS node development, where we have a position paper sort of in prep as well on Irish EOS node engagement, and at a more grassroots level of communication. There is Sunry data in Irish effectively particulars, and this is the data stewardship network that I've been involved with as a project partner, now on the committee post-project phase. And what we're doing is looking at assembling a micro-credential that will at least include some aspects of this infrastructure stuff amid the whole sort of RDM kind of setup. Okay, so in conclusion, both iCrag and UCD are learning from and integrating with other initiatives. There are a lot of sort of regular challenges around the place, and as I look around abroad, I see a lot of solutions that have really been developed to a very big way and put in place, say, starting 20 years ago, but hopefully we can start getting going now in a modern way. And key to that is this issue about who's going to take responsibility and how we're going to drive it. And that is really wrapped up with the national HPC and AI strategy implementation conversation that's going on amid the sort of among the top management in the funding agencies, the department and the universities at the moment. So we'll try and contribute to that through this EarthCheck publication in our little way, but really focus on the fair, facilitating open, but really we need to look at managing from an institutional perspective, managing IP. And on the communication side, I'm sort of trying to link up this kind of countrywide center stuff with the institutional RIT to the national initiatives and out to Giant and EOS. So that's me. Thank you. And back to Matt.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was very interesting. I want to open the floor for any questions to Chris. We did have one in the chat for Francois. Do you want me to read it, or would you like to read it yourself?
Let's see.
It's by
reference to the situation in France, it seems there is no data site contact point in Ireland which would facilitate DOI attribution. Okay, I'm not sure, to be quite honest. I know who I would ask about this, and I suspect that there would be one of my ex-colleagues at the Digital Repository of Ireland who would, who probably Beth, and I'm not sure who would be likely to be taking this role. Now, you can certainly get DOIs through certain repositories in Ireland, like if you're social science and humanities, go into the Digital Repository of Ireland and you'd be able to publish a DOI. What we're looking at is whether we can do this for how iCrag itself as a centre can do this for geoscience in Ireland. Now, I'm not saying that I know, I mean, if you have suggestions about the best way for a geoscience centre in a place that, you know, to do this, I'd be willing to, or happy to take them.
Yes, it's just a reference to the data center I belong to. In France, there is an institution which is the data site contact point, and we can get DOIs. We are associated to them, and we can get DOIs, because I saw you were thinking about how to get DOIs. It helps. So just in case there is something in Ireland, it can help you eventually. It was the reason for the question.
I think thank you. And I think I should sort of explain, I don't think that we are looking at getting set up in such a way that we would establish our own. We would kind of need to use other people's or another organization's linkages. And this is why the look at UCD at the moment. But maybe is it straightforward actually to set that up?
I am not the person who did it, but I think we are happy to have done that.
Okay, right. Maybe it's something to push for. Thank you.
Excellent. Any more questions for Chris before we move to the next item? No? Well, Chris, thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. And, I'm always happy to see Irish geoscience mentioned. That's my own background many, many years ago. So yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so let me go back to the main slide deck. Okay, so now we have a couple of slides that have been sent to repositories that also wanted to contribute but couldn't be here in person. So I've noted at the top that the people who have provided the slides, they're the people to direct your questions to. I can't speak to them. I can speak a little bit to some Morphobank things, but not to Bicodemo, which is actually Danny Kincaid, is one of the co-chairs at Sort Repository. So, and then after this, I think what we'll do is we'll just open the floor, and if there are any sort of open points for people from repository backgrounds want to talk about, or you don't have to be from a repository background, but we can open the floor at that point before we move on to the discussion of the interview framework. So, just move forward. So these slides have been, I don't know how to make this go away, but oops, sorry. So Morphobank is a repository that is very commonly used in biosciences, but also in my kind of familiarity with it comes from paleontology, and it basically is a place where researchers can deposit morphological matrices that relate to species definitions. So it's kind of on the edge of where life science fuses into geoscience. It's an interesting area, and I asked Morphobank when we asked them to contribute to this, where they found their snag points with journals where. And so Brooke Long Fox provided these slides from the perspective of Morphobank, and the general themes are things that we hear a lot. So in principle, journal editors recognize. This is paleontology specifically, journal editors recognize the importance of fair data for research validity, and there's strong conceptual support for this, for the deposition of the data and for transparency. But in practice, what Morphobank find is there's a reluctance to mandate. Certainly that the feedback that they get is that this is considered sometimes an additional hurdle for authors during submission. That is a very common refrain that we often hear. And editors and publishers are often very reluctant to put anything that might be perceived as a hurdle in place for authors. It's a very competitive landscape, and they don't want to lose papers by making the submission process really complex. And it can be perceived as a potential disincentive compared to journals without requirements. So yeah, it is competitive. There's that constant worry that editors and publishers express that they will lose papers if this is overly complicated. So, and then the enforcement is inconsistent or absent due to, and as a publisher, I agree completely with these points, limited editorial capacity for verification. So who is actually checking things at the point of publication in the journal workflow, and competing priorities in the editorial process. And that comes back to our original flywheel back at the start of the presentation. We were talking about this idea of speed and turnaround often being prioritized by publishers, but time being required for careful data curation by domain-specific repositories. So definitely something that they are seeing from their perspective as well. And they also want to send an example of some of the challenges they get when data deposition is not enforced. So this so this is where data is not deposited. It's not, as a result, it's not fair, or it's only partially fair, and it leads to a lot of issues with the data quality, its usability. They receive, and this is deposition after the point where the manuscript has been accepted. So again, kind of sitting in the exact point in the process that the working group is trying to address. And this is where they get non-standard file formats being submitted, limiting interoperability, incomplete data sets, so missing metadata, key files, and discrepancies between what's in the actual accepted paper and the data that they've chosen to upload to the repository. So the example here, and I'm not going to pretend that I fully understand what a zygomatic process of squamosal is, but the point is that the authors here have entered a state that was not one of the states that they would have had to assign in the metadata, and so the issue is that a new generic state has been created. And the point that Brooke made was, she said, this is something we could have caught well in advance if the data had been submitted prior to the paper going through. So this idea that they could have been doing that, the value of that curation could have been to correct issues with the data set prior to it going through the publication process, and now that is much more complex. So a final point from Morphobank, that choosing the right repository is very important, and underlining the points that we've made throughout about specialized repositories. This is from the perspective of the biological into geoscience kind of space, geobiology and paleontology, that they need to prioritize interoperability, reusability, and data review by subject matter experts. Again, I'm just working from the notes that Brooke has provided. I don't want to add additional, I don't want to misrepresent it. So if you've got any questions, please do follow up with her directly. And then some slides provided by Danny Kincaid from BCODEMO, which is the Biological and Chemical Oceanography Data Management Office at Woods Hole. That what they're been doing, their kind of feedback that they wanted to pass from their perspective, is that they're working to engage researchers early in data management planning, working with the investigators to process and publish the data well in advance. We talk a lot in the working group about trying to break this this kind of thinking that you work and you publish the paper and then you sort of think about the data, which is something that is very pervasive, and trying to change that behavior so that data deposition is happening well in advance and the creation has time to happen beforehand. So they're working to apply licensing, DOIs, great citation, documents, provenance, and versioning, and they employ emerging technologies, community best practices, and standards to improve discoverability, access, and reuse. And this point that we come back to over and over again, educating the research community on domain data best practices. So Danny sent over this, which is actually a sort of an excerpt of a conversation, a real conversation with a researcher, outlining the exact point that the working group is seeking to address. So you've got the first communication there on the 7th of January. Please find attached the data from my paper. The paper's been accepted. Here's the data, here's the metadata. And this is the point. I imagine we'll have quite a few weeks before anything will happen with this draft at the journal. They've been slower than this other journal that they're familiar with. It would be possible to publish the paper with data DOIs. And then 2 days later, the proofs have arrived. And this is something that publishers are working towards a lot. Getting those quick turnarounds, because that's something that authors repeatedly tell us they want. So the proofs have arrived this week. Much to my surprise, it does not seem feasible to add the DOIs to the paper unless you advise otherwise. So immediately that kind of issue about the time scale is becoming apparent from this conversation. They are not going to have time to do the curation that they need to do. And then finally, there's kind of sort of conclusion, it's not a great outcome. And the researcher asking what would have happened if I requested the DOI and I submit the paper and then deal with the rest of the paper might get rejected. So a lot of kind of like confusion and a need for education from the researcher's perspective, but also a need for the publisher and the domain-specific repository to understand each other's timelines. That's becoming apparent. And then another kind of note that Danny added is, they're only getting data that's relevant to the paper being submitted. That's another issue with this approach. They're not getting data that's relevant to the entire funded project. The data are being submitted after the drafting and submitting of the manuscript, which is to tie back to what Brooke was saying, not giving them time to identify issues within the data sets. That's the whole point of the curation process. And yeah, this time requirements of the journal for access and the need for the DOI, it's just not known between these different stakeholder groups. This is some of the challenges that we have, that we will be seeking to address with the working group. And not all data require disciplinary curation. That is something that is also worth noting. It doesn't have to be the case, but once the data goes to a generalist repository, often this PIs feel, this is the feedback from Ecodemo. And I don't want to put words in their mouth, but yeah, PIs feel that their data sharing work is done, that there isn't the robust curation being done. There's erroneous metadata. So here's an example, which is a little bit notorious, and I've seen this before, but where the funding has been linked not to the National Science Foundation, NSF, but to the National Sleep Foundation, also NSF. But this is obviously not relevant to that. So, this is an example of what they can, the value that they provide in catching errors and issues like this that can easily go through and aren't always necessarily picked up by a publisher on the other side. So extra work is needed due to the lack of metadata that's being provided. So some perspectives there from Ecodemo. So the questions that they are left with are, how do we encourage researchers, and I think they're correct here in saying that funders are part of that conversation as well, submit full project output, not just data that's referenced in the paper, and submit data once it's ready for analysis, not at the time of publication. Those are big questions about changing behavior patterns in research, and something that they are actively considering, and better align what's needed for publication. So what's actually needed to support the paper versus sharing the full project output, and manage the needs of publishers while providing robust curation of data. And remembering there's someone called the researcher. That's a good point, because this is very overwhelming from the researcher's point of view. So how, as we as stakeholders, as publishers, as repositories, how do we make this easier for the researcher caught in the middle? I remember back in that little flywheel diagram, the researcher had a lot of exasperated lightning bolts around them as they were being asked to accommodate both of these flywheels, and that's very true. Okay. So at this point, I think it would be good. We're at 10 to 9 now, so I think it'd be good if we want to have a bit of an open discussion. Anything that's come up so far you wanted to talk to, if you're from a repository, if you're from a publisher, just a general kind of open discussion about workflow challenges and points that you might want to raise based on Chris's talk, based on the last few slides, or anything else you've chatted about. Just want to open the floor. Anything you want to mention at this point, Leslie, or?
Yeah, I was just about to raise my hand. For those of you who don't know Ecodemo, it's supported by NSF. And quite a few grants that relate to BICODEMO stands for, was it biochemical oceanography data management, something or other. And so when you get a grant in that type of science, which is usually off the drilling ships and that, you have to agree to put your data into BICODEMO. And one of the problems they have is that, like with time pressures, people put their data set in the generalist repository and already get a DOI and then come and bring it to Danny to sort of put it into BICODEMO repository. And of course, that's not going to match the DOI of the publication. And what they get might have got a DOI through Zenodo, but it won't pass the curation testing of BICODEMO. And so then if they correct the data set and curate it properly, then it doesn't match the publication. And so what Danny's trying to do is swing it around so that people stop, what we call it quick DOI, stop going to Zenodo to get the quick DOI with the minimum metadata. But there again, it's causing complexity as well when the paper gets rejected, or heaven forbid, the editor actually looks at the data set and does some editing on it. And if you've already given it a DOI, you've got to give it another one. So this is kind of what we're on about. And that's why BICODEMO is a very good repository to work with, because researchers, as part of their grants, are directed to it to put their data there, which then leads to the other problem that Danny touched on, is that quite often they only get the data set that goes with the publication. They don't get the full data set that was part of the grant. And so, yeah, this is where the whole FAIR thing is falling down. And they feel that, BICODEMO feel they should be creating the whole data set that goes with the grant, not just the selected results, or heaven forbid, the highly derivative products, and not the primary observable data. So this is what we're trying to address.
Can I ask on that? Are they happy to? Well, the impression I get is they're not. But do you think they would be happy to work with a kind of, let's say, an interaction network of DOIs from different sources, or at least different locations? So it's kind of, how there are catalogs of repositories. Everything links together a bit, but there will be slight differences. There may be some repetition, but overall, you end up with a kind of interlinked system that can get you to the data.
Well, the issue of the data, the Zenodo DOI, is it does get you to the data, but firstly, the data has not been curated. And if you're after a fast DOI, you have only to fill in, I think it's 5 minimum metadata fields. So there's nothing that describes the data. So yeah, what you would do is the corrected one would be another version of the data, which itself would have a different DOI.
But you could link those DOIs, no?
Yeah, you could say this is the published version.
I should say this is an issue that I was sort of looking at, I hinted at in one of the slides with going to the Geological Survey, where it's really difficult to expect researchers to get their head around 230 odd different metadata fields, potential metadata fields, because they're not going to need all of them. But just being able to engage with that is quite tricky. So try and automate as much as possible. And I do want to try and get this automated, but yeah, the practicality has been that even with looking at trying to go to the mandated archive that we can point to, it's tricky. Sorry, we
Well,
need to keep things simple.
well, again, it's where we also need the help of the journals because a not very nice statistic is that like AGU journals, which are about 30-40% of Earth and environmental papers, have been insisting on DOIs for data for the last 5 years. And what they found last year was, I think, 72% of the DOIs for papers in their journals were Zenodo or a generalist repository, and the data was not the best, but sorry, the metadata was not the best. And then it gets into whether the editors, because this is another pushback we have, is that publishers or you can insist on having a DOI, but as part of the editorial process, it does require reviewing the data and its metadata, and there's a lot of pushback from the editors that they just don't have, or reviewers, that they don't have time to do it. So it's sort of going round and round in circles, and so that's why we kind of want to make it easier to start with to see if that improves it. Graham's been putting a few things in the chat. Matthew, I don't know whether you want to get Graham to speak.
Can do.
Graham, would you be happy to speak to that? I think that's a really interesting point you were making there about how you've been changing workflows. So if you're able to speak to that for a second, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, fine. So I think first of all, I just want to say that actually having DOIs mandated in kind of journals, or certainly really strongly encouraged, has actually been a great boon for us. We've seen the data providers are now coming to us actively as a domain repository to kind of give us data. Now, obviously, that leads the whole timeliness issue, and so we've tried to get ahead of the game as much as we can by educating upstream. So some of that has been getting our DOI policy and guidance out there as part of the whole sort of research council involvement in this. And the research council does actually mandate that if they fund the researchers, they put it into our repository. So that does help as well. The reporting mechanism around that is kind of the stick, which I think possibly is missing from this diagram, the COGS diagram. I just want to flag that one up as well. But yeah, one of the approaches we've had to take is actually think about what levels of curation we can actually apply to kind of make it a smoother process where we can be quick, where we don't see there's much value in going to the nth degree on the levels of curation and quality of the metadata in particular that's provided. And so we call that sort of reference only sort of level of curation. But where we can agree that there's actually going to be onward reuse, so really looking at kind of the I and the R of FAIR, then we can work with the providers, hopefully with sufficient timescales to kind of work those products up to a further extent. And if we've also got another level, which is sort of enhanced curation, where we can really start to build extra tools on top of that as well, so they can see greater sort of benefit. But I think the fact that we can put DOIs out on data sets and we say, look, that gets you kind of the credit out there as soon as possible, does actually kind of help to mitigate some of the worries that providers have about, oh, I don't want to get my data out too early. I need to kind of do it in time with the publication pipeline. So kind of helping them to divorce the data publication away from the kind of the paper publication to bring things further upstream is something which we have to continue taking to the community and educating them, and that's something which we have to keep going as well. One last point is we have been asked, can we reserve DOIs? And we don't formally do it, and we hesitate about doing it because sometimes data don't arrive for whatever reason, because people want to go off and pursue the next lot of funding and they move on. But kind of holding back does sort of encourage the data providers to kind of move a little bit quicker. Well, we try to be responsive, but it is quite a stressful environment sometimes when you've been asked, oh, I need the DOIs like yesterday. So you end up people working, silly hours. And I've had that recently with colleagues like working over the weekends and stuff to try and turn around for providers. So yeah, it's not great, but I think overall we're in a better place from we were, say, like 10, 15 years ago.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting to hear about that different levels of curation. I think that's it's interesting. I mean, we do a similar thing in well at Taylor and Francis. We uh not similar in the sense of that, but in terms of the level of support that we provide, like the editorial support that we talk about being a barrier to getting compliance with a lot of this stuff. We formally set journals at different data sharing policy levels, and that gives them access to increased staffing and stuff. So it's this idea of like matching it to journals where this is going to be every single paper. They're going to need much more support versus stuff that, just managing that kind of balancing that kind of staffing, time, turnaround, that kind of thing. Okay. Any other questions? Any other points anyone wants to raise there? All right, cool. So we can move on to our last section then, which is the collaborative session. So questions for publishers and editors. So Leslie has kindly shared the link in the chat. And Leslie, I don't know if you can also share the link directly to the questions. That would be very useful, but they should be linked from the session notes. So what we would, so the kind of framework here is we've put in the IRB approval with the questions for repositories that we want to ask. And those have been fairly, they've been gone through in different groups, and they were discussed in Costa Rica at the last plenary as well. And we have submitted those with the understanding that we may tweak the publishing and the editing questions and put that through as an amendment, which the IRB is happy with. So we have the freedom to discuss those questions here. So I wonder if we could just take a few minutes to, if everyone is not able to access those questions, please flag in the chat. But if you could take a minute just to review those questions, and then maybe we could have a discussion or a bit of a brainstorm. Feel free to also leave notes if you don't want to speak. That's completely understandable. There's the ability to add just annotations to that, or to add points as bullet points in the main collaborative session notes. But if we're able to have a bit of a chat, that would be fantastic. Sorry, Leslie.
I'm not sure I've got the right link. That's, can you check that one, or you can't see the chat?
No, I can see it's okay. Yeah, this is the right one.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, these are the current iteration of the questions that we have. So maybe there's a lot to digest there. So maybe we could take a couple of minutes just to read through. I'll just go off camera for a couple of minutes and maybe call us back at I make it 9:03. I could call us back at 9:06, 9:07, just have a read through, and then we can have a chat. Does that sounds good to everyone? Okay, thanks. Okay. So we've all had a little chance to read through that. Don't know if anyone has any immediate thoughts, any high level thoughts even on this. Anyone want to share some initial feedback? Put this on the screen as well. So the goal of these questions is this will be the framework for the interviews, semi-structured interviews that we will have with representatives from publishers. So if I know we've got a couple of people from publishers here. So I guess, do you think that this is adequately giving this kind of framework of questions is adequately giving the opportunity to explain the complexity within the process? Is there anything that we've obviously missed? Is there anything that we've come at from an incorrect angle, or anything that we'd like to add there? Or we can also have general discussion on the questions. If you're from a repository standpoint, what do you want to ask publishers about their workflow?
Have one comment from my experience at Cambridge University Press is that all of these things are so varied across our journals. I think these questions make a lot more sense at a journal and a journal editor level than at a publisher level. Like, I think I'm just looking at the questions and thinking my answers to almost all of them would be, it depends on the journal.
Yeah.
I could give examples from some journals, but I think you get a lot more, well, in our case, certainly you get a lot more information or useful information by talking to people at the journal level. Or at the society level, even where they have, a couple of journals by a specific society, where they have similar policies.
That's a really, really good point. And that's something that I've tried to convey. I completely agree with that. This would be the same for me. I have 18 journals in my portfolio. They all have different sharing procedures, different ways that they integrate with repositories or don't integrate with repositories. Okay, so that's good to know. Because what we'd kind of hoped was we would have with the publishers a sort of a higher level kind of series of questions, almost at like a policy level or different policy levels, and then the second set of questions would be getting into that more specifically for editors. But do you think it would be useful? Yeah.
So
even
following on from that, with you as publishers, do you think it could be standardized? Like we could get a more coherent workflow, or you think it is going to end up being very journal specific? That like the habits you've got at the moment are because it's just grown like that within each journal. Is it possible to get a bit more standardization to kind of help it with the repositories? Because I certainly know the repositories are finding it very hard to cope with the more detailed different requirements of all the different journals. And having been someone who's worked in standards for years.
I can speak a little bit to that, but I don't want to. I mean, I want to make sure that other people are heard. And so maybe Kieran, if you could give your thoughts on this as well, that would be amazing. But my view is yes, to some extent. But it depends on who owns the journal. So in that list of 18, about half of those are owned by learned societies who control their own editorial policy. So they define what they want to do, and we as publishers facilitate that. Taylor and Francis does not set, in our specific case, we do not set that policy. If a university or a museum or a society tells me, right, we feel it's right and we want to move the data sharing policy level, we want to mandate certain elements of the process, we want enhanced checks, they are setting that policy and we have to facilitate that. On a TNF owned journal, it might be different. There might be more potential for standardization there. So as a result, yeah, there isn't, particularly where you have a lot of titles that are owned by a third party where they have that editorial control, you end up going to the, what those different learned societies consider to be the benchmark. There's not a lot you can really do other than try to build platforms that make it as easy as possible to integrate with journals at different levels.
Yeah, that's pretty much my experience. I wish we could make all of the workflows a lot more standardized. I wish we could have a single workflow and that all the journals would follow it. But out of 400 plus journals, 2/3 of the ones that we publish are owned by third parties or owned by societies, and we work with them. And a large part of my role is trying to convince them to adopt standard policies and trying to convince them to adopt standard workflows and to deposit data and all those sorts of things. But yeah, as Matthew says, like a lot of the control belongs to societies, and that's part of the deal we have when we help facilitate publishing for them.
I find this really interesting because, as you know, we're trying to get a group going called One Geochemistry, and there's about 8 different chemical societies, associations involved. And what we're trying to do is get them to standardize on the vocabularies that are used in the data, the methods. And so I was just thinking, oh, this is something else we'll add to pressuring the societies, because certainly there's a lot of vocabularies floating around that have no scientific credibility. And so what we're trying to do is get the societies to say, look, this is the endorsed one by our group. And so I guess it's making societies aware of a greater role they can play in getting on board with standards in a lot of the things they do. So I'll take that one on board. I hadn't thought of it before.
Yeah, it's a really, I think they're actually, I mean, it's a good point that they're actually maybe a stakeholder group that we're not capturing here. Is the role that they play in setting that. I mean, I know that's why we take the approach, I know other publishers do the same, of different data share policy levels. And the idea is to put as many journals into as similar a bucket as possible so we can standardize while still giving them the freedom to set the level that they feel is appropriate. It is just, yeah, an attempt to try to standardize while allowing them to retain editorial control.
It just might be something worth bringing up with like CoData and their World Fair project, because I work with them. And I know that like we have a meeting every couple of months with the data groups from the scientific unions and societies. But there we're trying to push standardization of data. But yet the way most data is published, which is why I spend time on this work, is it's going through the journals. So if you want to capture the data, you've kind of got to work at the publications. So it's just an interesting stakeholder group we haven't considered, but I could see, no, I might give Simon Hodson a ping and say, hey, how about this one? If someone could, if like you and Kira could document the problem statement more precisely. I mean, I think you've both got it. It's just, if that could be documented somewhere, then we can pass it on like to CoData, to the Science Union societies, and say, gee whiz, you could really help here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to have a chat about that at some point.
That'd be really good.
Yeah, it does tie to this, wider conversation and points Graham was making too about like how we can engage the best different routes to engage with researchers and sort of change this behavior, divorcing this like data publication part of the journey from manuscript publication part of the journey. I think learning societies have an important role there, especially when they own the leading journals in the field. This is a good point. It's a really good take home. Anyone else have any points on this? Oh, sorry, Graham, go ahead.
Yeah, just very quickly on that, sort of to encourage people to divorce the data publication away from the journal publication. It also goes back to kind of, where people get credit for their work and kind of recognition for their work. That kind of data publication in its own right is a good output alongside and equal to kind of journal publications. So if we can encourage that in kind of the funder sphere, then it kind of encourages that to happen as well. So I think kind of the funder might be kind of a missing element as well. Not on that regard, but also kind of on the policies which they can sort of mandate about get your data out in a timely manner as well as part of that.
Yeah, well, that's where I get impressed with like Danny's group, and I certainly know like with NSF, so all certain data has to go into the polar, from the ICE has to go into a certain repository, but it's only a few NSF directorates that do that. Certainly in Australia, I don't think the Australian Research Council does that. But I think by directing from the funders, directing that the data needs to be in a domain repository, really does help things along.
Can I ask if we're going for sort of, well, that kind of direction, the data publication, this is a question for Graham, I suppose. Data publication, separate from paper publication, is there an implication there that the data that's published is going to need to be hosted by the place it's published?
Yes. That's definitely one aspect. I mean, there's also, I suppose, that there's levels of data publication which we see as well. One is just to get it into a repository, a DOI kind of goes out. That's one level. The other one is data papers as well, and how the kind of two tie together. So I think kind of the latter one, there's probably a greater degree of scrutiny that applies, but there's a greater lead time in that as well. Is there a difference in kind of how those two outputs are treated? That's an open question, I think, as well. But yeah, I think ultimately, if you're going to be publishing data, yeah, you've got to put it somewhere and kind of got to think about how you resource that from a funder perspective. But if the funder's going to, put the money in to do it, I think they also have to make sure that they get the rewards back as well, which is, where you have the data policies in place to kind of encourage that and the funding goes in, it works reasonably well. But when those two are disconnected, that's a harder situation.
We've got an interesting one with AusScope in Australia, which is Earth Science infrastructure funding, and they're now starting to insist that the data that comes off the machine or the primary observable data has to go into a repository with a DOI. So we're really going upstream. And what we're ultimately hoping is that when the data products are published in the journals, they will link back to the primary observable data set. And that's where the facilities and the infrastructure projects need to get the data citations, because if they're only quoting the products and not referencing back to the primary source data, they're not getting any citations or credit for what they've invested in, and the funders have got no return on investment. So then we'd have to get publishers, you again, to insist that, you accept the data products with the, that goes with the paper, but within that paper, there should be a citation on what the primary source data was.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of benefits to that approach, of course. I think in the short to medium term, realistically, people are still going to be publishing data alongside publications. So yeah, like this work to try and make sure that process all links up with repositories is going to be crucial, at least in the short and medium term. Maybe sometime in the future, everyone will publish data sets completely separately to journal articles, but yeah, that's a longer term.
Your biggest problem is that the researcher, like we have made a change on where we were, say, 10 years ago, when data was in supplements and disappearing. And what we're capturing now is the data that goes with the publication. But as Danny pointed out in her presentation, it's not the data that was collected. And there's appalling stories starting to emerge of, researchers going to the local electronics store on their way out to do a survey, and the data staying on like hard drives. Because in some research institutions, they're not even getting the facilities to store that raw data as they bring it in. So it's a whole can of worms that's starting to open up around that, particularly with the newer data types with the really high resolution sensors, because it's just so voluminous.
Yeah, it's very challenging to actually set up to provide the infrastructure, and it's kind of, the more you provide, the more will come as well. The more data could be retained. I'm thinking about modeling data sets where you really would want to retain modeled data, but then at what level? At some stage, you need to some sort of decisions need to be made. But equally, as we can provide more, we should, and it's great. But yeah, there's definitely a difference between, say, an institutional perspective where you need to be providing enterprise level storage, and an individual researcher's level where they're just not committed to the same level of versioning, backup, and this kind of stuff.
Okay, so some of the feedback to sort of summarize a little bit would be that these publisher questions, so we've tried to kind of raise them to a higher policy level. They're still quite journal specific. Has anyone had a chance to read the editor questions, which we had hoped would be a bit more journal specific, but also focusing on the impact on researchers as editors, right, as opposed to publishers. So sort of thinking about time, thinking about how this is impacting them. Has anyone had a chance to read through these questions? Do you think that these do a better job, or do you think there's overlap? If you think that these don't work, the publisher questions don't work at a higher level of decision making, do these questions do a better job of doing that?
Just to clarify on the publisher questions, I think the first few questions they're really good at a higher level. I think when it starts to get into the specifics of, who's responsible for checking the data availability statement, I mean, the question there might be like, how much does this vary across your journals as well?
Yeah.
So yeah, but I think the editor level questions are looking really good. I think those are the sorts of questions that an individual journal or, a society with a few journals could probably give quite clear answers to. Yeah, and some of these things, I know the tier 2 pilot was mentioned earlier. We've got a few of our journals who are participating in that and trying to investigate specifically some of these questions, like, how much additional time does this take per paper, and how much more difficult does this make your process if you add in more checks? So I know you mentioned that you're already talking to tier 2, but certainly I think that, the pilot 8 is running until the end of June. And after that, they're going to be looking at qualitatively what sort of things journals have found. So I think there might be answers to some of these questions in the outcomes of that pilot. They'll be really good to collaborate on. But yeah, I think these are good questions.
Oh, good. Thank you. That's good feedback to have. Yeah, absolutely. So, a couple of my colleagues from the Open Data and Open Science team at DNF are closely involved with that project. So we are, communicating about, just making sure that what we're doing is, they're, I think, more focused on sort of the process, that internal workflow process, the checks, the staffing, the when things are done, the where things are done, and ways that they can standardize across publishing groups. So we're kind of still trying to take that specific angle of the repository integration or the domain specific repository touch points to sort of go a little bit step further, but try not to. I think it's gonna help us in the long run that they're also working in that, and then also that their outputs will be beneficial, will probably be useful to them because it'll be an input for us for sure.
I mean, I'm not sure exactly what questions they're going to ask us at the end of the pilot at this point. So yeah, I've been coordinating the journals, and the internal editors have been leading these journals that are participating in the pilot. So at the moment we're just at the stage of introducing new checks, but it might be interesting to coordinate with them on which questions they ask at the end of the pilot and how they might be helpful to you in this work. Because as you say, you're going into more specifics about repositories, whereas they're looking in quite a lot of detail at workflow and workflow checks.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of what in the publisher questions, I guess, the questions like who's checking data availability statements. That's good. What you said was really good and very valuable about sort of saying how does that vary? Because I think that's what I was kind of thinking when I drafted that question was, is it a journal editorial office? Is it a publisher editorial office? Is it someone like a data editor on a journal? Is it the editor in chief? And that is going to vary. That's a good point. I guess I was thinking, what are the options at a high level? What are the options?
I think making that explicit in the framing of the question is good, because I read that question. My first answer is it varies, but if you specifically say how does this vary and why and what factors influence it, I think you'll get more direct and clear answers.
Yeah. That's good.
And maybe something that comes out of that will be, well, it really depends on the society, or it really depends on which peer review system we're using. And then those might be other groups that you could reach out to, as Leslie was saying earlier.
Yeah, we have at some point earlier, I'm not sure where we got up to on it, we have considered bringing in representatives from different platforms, like ScholarOne, but at the end of the day, as we also know, how sites and how things are configured varies journal by journal, publisher by publisher. So again, it's kind of it gets into that issue again, doesn't it? Really?
And to an extent, what ScholarOne builds and develops depends on what all of their publisher customers are asking for, right? So
yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay. Oh, sorry. Graham has a question. I'm aware that we're approaching time. Just quickly, if part of this around timeliness workload, do journals find the volume of work is evenly distributed throughout the year in terms of submissions and review availability? Is it quite lumpy? That's a good question. How can we help to smooth this out, spread the load? That's a good question. I mean, I would say yes. It is lumpy. Yeah, how do we? That's a good question.
I mean, that's probably something you could probably just ask as a separate, question. what's the lumpiness? Do you sort of see any patterns? And the can we work together to kind of smooth that process? Avoid kind of like busy times of year when people are going to be away, like the summer holidays and Christmas time and things like that. And
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think that's
please.
a really good question to ask, both at a journal level and probably at a publisher level too, because publishers might see trends across different domains of research in different journals, whereas a specific journal will be able to give you a really good answer on what happens in their specific domain.
yeah, do you see kind of like peaks ahead of like big key conferences as well?
Yeah, very domain specific. Also very much depends on the predominant author geographies of the journal as well. Definitely see you get in my journals, I can see the impact of different academic years, different parts of the world. Everyone
Yeah, I was
does
going to
things,
say,
then goes out field work.
when you mentioned summer holidays, I mean, who's summer?
As I was thinking that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I think we're at time for the session. So we can wrap up at this point, but I want to thank you so much for that. We got a lot of good feedback and perspectives there. I hope the session was interesting and useful, and you got an idea of how the project is developing. I think we're sitting now right at the point of really kick off once we get that institutional review board approval through, which should be very soon because it's been going smoothly, the process. We should be able to move quite rapidly to the next stages in the process. So yeah, do feel free if you've got more comments and thoughts to add to the documents that have been linked. That would be very, very grateful. If you've got any suggestions or you'd be willing to be interviewed yourself as part of this, or please do add your information to that spreadsheet as well. But yeah, I think we can wrap up there, and thank you very much for your time, and hope to see you again perhaps at the next plenary, or we do have the monthly working group meetings as well. But yeah, thank you very much.
Turn the recording off.
I can't. How do I do that? Oh, I can.